In the dazzling heart of the Byzantine Empire, where golden mosaics glittered in the sunlight and the wealth of the world flowed into Constantinople, a darker truth was hidden. Behind the shimmering palaces and towering domes, there existed a world of shadows, vice, and cruelty so shocking that even Roman excess paled in comparison. And from this abyss of degradation would rise one of the most powerful women in history, a woman who clawed her way from the filth of humiliation to the very throne of the empire itself. Her name was Theodora, but who was she really? To later generations, Theodora is remembered as the wife of Justinian, one of Byzantium's greatest rulers. Yet before she ever wore the imperial crown, her life was one of scandal, pain, and survival in a city that could devour the weak whole. Hers is not merely a tale of Byzantine splendor. It is the story of how the empire's darkest practices forged its fiercest empress. Let's step back for a moment into the world she was born into. Constantinople was a city of extremes. On one hand, it was a jewel of the East, markets overflowing with silks and spices, churches shimmering with sacred relics, and the Hippodrome, where roaring crowds gathered for chariot races. But on the other hand, beneath the glitter, the city crawled with vice. Brothels, gambling dens, and degrading performances turned entertainment into spectacle, and spectacle into humiliation. At the very heart of this contradiction stood the Hippodrome. For the citizens, it was not just an arena. It was the beating heart of public life. Here emperors rose and fell with the cheers or the riots of the people. But beneath its stands, in its hidden corners, prostitution thrived at unimaginable levels. Children were dragged into this world long before they could even understand it. And one of them was Theodora. Her father, a bear trainer for the Hippodrome, died when she was still a child. Left desperate, her mother did what many poor women of Constantinople had to do. She pushed her daughters onto the stage. But in Byzantium, the word actress was little more than a polite mask for something else. To act meant to degrade yourself before drunken crowds. The performances were lewd, crude, designed not to inspire but to amuse and excite at the cost of a child's dignity. Theodora quickly became infamous for one particular performance, even though she was barely in her teens. Chroniclers recall that she played the role of a swan pursued by geese that stripped her not only of clothes, but of dignity itself. The crowds roared with laughter. Her name was burned into memory, not as a girl, but as an object of ridicule. And yet, even in this pit of humiliation, Theodora was learning. She studied men, their desires, their lies, their endless hunger for control. And though she was used, discarded, and debased, she began to see something others did not. Power, hidden within weakness. She would smile as if unbroken, act as if she felt no shame, but inside she was hardening, sharpening her mind into a weapon. This was the world that tried to destroy her, but it would also be the crucible that made her. As Theodora grew, her life followed a brutal rhythm: exploitation, survival, betrayal. She traveled with theater troupes across the empire, performing in taverns, cheap stages, and even palaces. At times, she became the mistress of powerful men, gaining temporary comfort, fine clothes, and luxuries she had never dreamed of. But each time it ended the same way. She was cast aside, abandoned, left to wander once more. Her lowest point came in North Africa. There, sick and destitute, far from the bustling streets of Constantinople, she nearly died. Alone, betrayed, stripped of everything, she could have vanished into history as just another broken woman chewed up by the empire's cruelty. But she didn't. Instead, she found something unexpected: faith. During these years of wandering, Theodora encountered a radical form of Christianity. It was not the cold, institutional faith of priests and bishops, but a raw belief that suffering had meaning, that scars could become strength. This revelation reshaped her. She began to believe she had endured for a reason, that her torment was not her end, but her weapon. When she returned to Constantinople, she was not the same girl who had once played the swan to the jeers of drunken crowds. She was transformed, still scarred, yes, but also sharpened by pain and burning with determination. Her beauty was undeniable, but now it was paired with wit, cunning, and an iron resolve. People began to whisper her name not just for her looks, but for her sharp tongue and her clever mind. She outmaneuvered flatterers, exposed liars, and bent admirers to her will. She had learned how to manipulate the very desires that once enslaved her. And it was then that fate placed her before the man who would change her life forever: Justinian. Justinian was no ordinary man. Nephew of the emperor, ambitious, brilliant, and determined, he was destined to rule. And when he met Theodora, he was captivated, not only by her beauty, but by her strength. Unlike the noble women of the court, Theodora had fire. She had lived, suffered, survived. Justinian saw not just a woman, but an equal. But there was a problem. In Byzantine society, Actresses and prostitutes were branded with a permanent stigma. Laws even forbade them from marrying men of high rank. To elevate Theodora would mean scandal, outrage, disgrace. The court exploded with fury at the idea. Priests denounced it, nobles mocked it, and whispers spread like wildfire. But Justinian would not bend. He loved her, and he admired her strength more than the opinions of courtiers. He fought to change the very law of the empire, overturning centuries of prejudice to make Theodora his wife. And he won. Against every tradition, against every voice of outrage, Theodora rose from the gutters of Constantinople's stages to the imperial throne itself. From a girl forced into degrading performances to a woman crowned in imperial purple, her story was already unbelievable. But her true test, her true rise to power, was only just beginning. Because Theodora would not be content with being a silent empress. She would rule, and in fire and blood, she would prove herself stronger than anyone imagined. Theodora's coronation was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her true reign. For while most Byzantine empresses were expected to remain quiet ornaments beside their husbands, Theodora refused invisibility. From the very first day she entered the palace draped in imperial purple, she ruled not as a shadow but as Justinian's equal. Whispers filled the court. Nobles sneered, recalling her scandalous past. Priests thundered that God would punish the empire for allowing a former actress, a woman once mocked in taverns, to wear the crown. Even noblewomen turned their backs on her, refusing to dine with someone they saw as forever stained. But Theodora did not flinch. She had endured worse than sneers and whispers. She had been laughed at, humiliated, spat upon, discarded, and she had survived it all. Now she had something far more powerful than beauty, more powerful even than love. She had authority. True authority bound to the throne of the Byzantine Empire, and she intended to wield it without hesitation. In council meetings, she sat beside Justinian on a golden throne, her voice sharp, decisive, impossible to ignore. Foreign ambassadors, senators, and generals all had to reckon with her presence. Justinian himself consulted her on laws, policies, and appointments, often deferring to her judgment. For the first time in Byzantine history, the empire was ruled not by one mind, but by two. And yet, no matter how much power she wielded, her enemies never let her forget her past. They spread stories of her early years, sending tales of her humiliations to foreign courts in hopes of disgracing the empire. But Theodora struck back with ferocity. Those who mocked her were exiled. Those who plotted against her disappeared into dungeons. Even the Patriarch of Constantinople, the highest churchman in the city, dared not challenge her openly. Still, all of this was only preparation for the trial that would define her reign, the greatest uprising in Byzantine history. The year was 532. The Hippodrome, once the place where Theodora's father had worked and where her childhood had begun in humiliation, would now become the stage for her greatest test. The city erupted in chaos as the famous racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, turned their rivalry into full-blown rebellion. What began as a protest against Justinian's rule quickly spiraled out of control. Crowds poured into the streets, setting fire to palaces, markets, and churches. The city burned, smoke choking the skies of Constantinople. Rioters stormed through neighborhoods, looting as they went, and in the Hippodrome itself, they declared a rival emperor. Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, was collapsing in fire and blood. Inside the palace, panic reigned. Senators abandoned Justinian, nobles whispered of surrender, and the emperor himself, faced with flames at his gates, considered fleeing. Justinian was ready to abandon the crown, to run for his life. The empire seemed lost. And then Theodora rose. Standing in the council chamber, surrounded by terrified men, she delivered a speech that would echo through history. Chroniclers preserved her words. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. She told them she would rather die an empress than live in disgrace. She would not flee. She would not surrender. Her courage shamed the men into action. Justinian, emboldened by her defiance, called his generals to strike back. And when the dust settled, the empire would never again underestimate Theodora. Theodora's words were more than a speech. They were a command. While the men around her debated escape, she had already chosen her fate. Better to die with the purple wrapped around her shoulders than to live stripped of power. Her iron will broke through Justinian's fear, forcing him to act. The generals, including the legendary Belisarius, moved swiftly. Troops surrounded the Hippodrome, where tens of thousands of rebels had gathered to crown their new emperor. At first, the crowd roared in triumph, believing Justinian had already fled. But then the trap was sprung. The exits were sealed. Soldiers poured into the arena, swords drawn, shields raised. The rioters had nowhere to run. Panic erupted as the imperial troops advanced. Screams filled the air, echoing against the stone walls of the Hippodrome. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. By the time the massacre ended, The sands of the arena were soaked with blood. Over 30,000 corpses lay piled in the Hippodrome, the rebellion crushed in a single day of merciless violence. Constantinople was silent. Smoke still rose from its charred streets, but the empire had been saved, and everyone knew the truth. It was Theodora who had saved it. Without her defiance, Justinian would have fled. Without her resolve, the empire might have fallen. From that day forward, even her bitterest enemies were forced to respect her. She was no longer the courtesan, no longer the scandal, no longer the shameful wife. She was the empress who had stared into the abyss and refused to flinch. And Theodora did not waste the power she had secured. Having endured humiliation as a girl, she turned her pain into policy. She fought to protect women trapped in the same brutal world she had once known. She pushed for laws forbidding the forced prostitution that had scarred her youth. She founded safe houses where women could escape the trade, offering them dignity instead of scorn. Her reforms went further. Women could now own property, inherit wealth, and divorce abusive husbands. For the 6th century, these laws were nothing short of revolutionary. And they did not come from abstract ideals or philosophical debates, they came from her scars. The girl who had once been paraded before drunken crowds now stood as a protector for others, ensuring no one would suffer as she had. But make no mistake, Theodora was not only compassionate, she could be ruthless, merciless, and vengeful. Enemies who dared to challenge her met exile, ruin, or death. Rivals were destroyed not just politically, but personally. Even Justinian himself, the emperor of the Byzantine world, sometimes feared the sharp edge of her temper. This duality defined her. To her allies, she was a savior, a defender, a reformer. To her enemies, she was a tyrant cloaked in jewels. But to everyone, one truth was undeniable: she was power incarnate. Yet, despite her triumphs, despite her unmatched influence, Theodora carried invisible scars. Whispers of her youth never fully disappeared. Even as she ruled an empire, some noble women still refused to share her table. Priests muttered that no amount of charity could cleanse her past. She wore her crown with pride, but beneath the purple and gold the wounds of humiliation remained. For all her victories, Theodora lived with a haunting irony. The same degradation that once sought to break her had in truth created her. The chains of her past became her weapons. The shame once forced upon her became her crown. She had turned survival into domination, scars into power. But history is never merciful. For every ruler there comes an enemy no strength can defeat. And for Theodora, that enemy was not priests, nor nobles, nor rebels. It was death itself. In the prime of her power, when her influence was unmatched and her voice shaped the destiny of an empire, Theodora fell ill. Chroniclers whispered of a wasting sickness, perhaps cancer, that slowly consumed her body. Yet even as pain gnawed at her, she refused to yield. She still attended councils, still advised Justinian, still ruled as though nothing had changed. Her enemies hoped to see weakness, to watch her falter, but she denied them that satisfaction. Theodora had endured humiliation, betrayal, and rebellion. She would not let her illness rob her of dignity, but fate would not be denied. In the year 548, at only 48 years old, Theodora's strength finally failed. Within the very palace she had once entered as an outcast, the empress who had risen from filth to glory took her last breath. Justinian was shattered. The man who had nearly abandoned his crown during the Nika revolt wept openly for the woman who had saved it. He had lost not only his empress, but his partner, his equal, the only person who had ever matched his ambition and will. For the empire, her death was more than the loss of a ruler. It was the silencing of a storm. The woman who had defied scandal, silenced priests, crushed rebellion, and reshaped laws was gone. Constantinople mourned, but it also remembered. Her reforms endured, protecting women long after her death. Her courage during the Nika revolt remained legendary, retold through the centuries. And her name, once spat in ridicule, became entwined with the greatness of Byzantium itself. Think of the arc of her life for a moment. A girl mocked on stage, forced to play obscene roles for drunken crowds. A courtesan scorned, abandoned, humiliated. And yet, that same woman rose higher than anyone thought possible. She sat on a golden throne, her words shaping the empire, her courage saving it from collapse. Theodora's story forces us to confront a question. Do our scars define us, or do we define what those scars become? For Theodora, the answer is clear. She did not allow her pain to destroy her. She transformed it, wielded it, and in doing so, she dominated an empire that once spat on her name. History remembers her not as a victim, not merely as Justinian's wife, but as Theodora, the empress who rose from degradation to power. And as we look back, one thing becomes undeniable. The Byzantine Empire was never the same after her. Theodora's death marked the end of an era, but her presence never truly left the empire. Her spirit lingered in the laws she created, in the courage she displayed, and in the legacy that even her fiercest enemies could not erase. She had begun her life in the shadows, a figure mocked and degraded, and ended it as the most powerful woman Byzantium had ever known. Think about that for a moment. How many others were silenced by humiliation, discarded by society, forgotten in the darkness? And yet Theodora refused to remain in the shadows. She seized her pain, turned it into a weapon, and used it to climb higher than anyone believed she could. Her life forces us to ask, how many other stories like hers have been hidden by history? How many voices were buried because they did not fit the narrative of noble bloodlines or heroic men? Theodora proves that sometimes the most unlikely person can change the course of an empire. But was she a hero? Or was she ruthless? The answer depends on where you stand. To the women she protected, she was a savior. To the nobles she crushed, she was a tyrant. To Justinian, she was a partner he could never replace. But to history, she remains unforgettable. And here's the lesson her life leaves us with. Your past does not have to define your future. Theodora's scars did not make her weak, they made her unstoppable. She transformed shame into strength, and by doing so, she changed the destiny of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Even centuries later, her voice still echoes through time, and it whispers to us, we are not the sum of our scars, but the sum of what we choose to become. So, what do you think? Was Theodora a merciless empress who ruled with an iron fist? Or was she a survivor who turned pain into power? Tell me in the comments below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story shocked you, inspired you, or made you see history in a new way, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and bring more stories like this to you. Make sure you subscribe, so you never miss another untold history. Because if you thought Theodora's rise was incredible, just wait until you see what comes next. On your screen right now, there's another story that will take you even deeper into the secrets of Rome and Byzantium. Click it, and let's keep uncovering the hidden truths of history together. Thank you for watching. Remember, we are the ones who remember, the ones who question, the ones who refuse to bow to the silence of history. And you, are you ready for the next secret of Rome?